Hello everyone, welcome to part 4 and the final part of chapter 15. So we are going to talk about schizophrenia. This entire module focuses on schizophrenia, which I think is great because schizophrenia is one of those mental disorders that is really kind of misunderstood, and there's a lot of myths and stigma surrounding it. So I think it's great to talk about the actual facts. So we're going to talk about schizophrenia here. I've also posted the full notes for chapter 15 on Moodle. They don't have the audio attached, but it's just a slideshow of all of the notes combined if you want to kind of have them all in one place. And you might notice I did keep some information in there at the end on addiction and substance use because it is classified at times as a type of psychological illness, and so your old textbook had a lot of information on it, so I just kept it in there for your own purposes if you're interested, but it will not be tested on. And I even have in the slideshow, I have a heading that says, anything from here on won't be tested. So it's just there if you'd like that information, if you're interested, but don't worry about it for our exam. So what we're going to cover right now, is the remainder of the content that will be on your final exam. So module 15.4 is schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is often regarded as one of the most devastating psychological illnesses. So unfortunately it is associated with a lot of negative outcomes and kind of detriments to daily functioning. It's sometimes referred to as the cancer of mental illness since there are so many subtypes and variations. So just like with cancer, we have all different types of cancer and causes of cancer. Kind of the same thing happens with schizophrenia. There's a lot of different kind of outcomes and things associated with it as well. Schizophrenia is not a common disorder. It only affects about 4 to 8 people out of 1,000, but it does appear to be universal. So we have seen evidence of people exhibiting symptoms of schizophrenia kind of worldwide in different cultures. It's something that isn't new. It's been around for a long time. Some of our earliest writings describe people who seem to have lost touch with reality. So talking about people who hear voices or produce bizarre speech and behaviors. So earlier in history, when, way back when they used to talk about these types of people, a person experiencing these types of symptoms may have been suspected of demonic possession or witchcraft, or even praised for having a special connection to the spirit world. So people might have thought that they were some kind of divine person. But now we would likely diagnose them with schizophrenia. So despite the fact that, it's only been in the past 100 years or so that we've had that diagnosis and we've had information on the disorder, we've definitely seen cases of it from kind of way before those times as well. So in terms of the symptoms and types of schizophrenia, this is part of what makes schizophrenia so difficult to diagnose and treat, is that there are a ton of different symptoms and there are a bunch of different subtypes of schizophrenia. And there are also different stages that people progress through during their experience of schizophrenia. So schizophrenia is defined as a brain disease that causes the person to experience significant breaks from reality, a lack of integration of thoughts and emotions, and problems with attention and memory. One of the most important things to point out here is that it is not the same thing as dissociative identity disorder. A lot of people, and unfortunately this has been perpetuated by the media and movies and TV shows, if somebody is exhibiting kind of evidence of having multiple personalities, a lot of the time people call them schizophrenic or label them as a schizo. And multiple personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder and schizophrenia are not the same thing. Symptoms sometimes begin to occur and escalate very gradually, while at other times they may begin and escalate very rapidly. So again, with schizophrenia, you're going to see a lot of different variations in how it presents itself, in kind of how rapid the onset is and how severe the symptoms are. So again, that kind of links back to why we consider it almost like the cancer of mental illness. There are so many different variations and different outcomes. In most cases of schizophrenia, we have 3 distinct stages: the prodromal stage, the active stage, and the residual stage. So we'll talk a bit about what each of those mean. So with respect to the stages of schizophrenia, the prodromal stage is basically kind of the initial stage a lot of the time, in which people may become easily confused and have difficulty organizing their thoughts. They may lose interest and begin to withdraw from friends and family. They may lose their normal motivations, withdraw from their life, and spend increasing amounts of time alone, often deeply engrossed in their own thoughts. So at times, unfortunately, these types of symptoms lead those around them to kind of assume that they're just being lazy or not wanting to kind of participate. And actually, if you kind of look at the symptoms that are discussed here, you may notice that they kind of share a lot of common characteristics with the symptoms of depression. So often in the beginning, especially in the prodromal phase, schizophrenia may be not diagnosed or misdiagnosed. The second phase is known as the active phase. So in this phase, people are typically experiencing kind of the major hallmark symptoms of schizophrenia. They may experience delusional thoughts, hallucinations, or disorganized patterns of thoughts, emotion, and behavior. So in the active stage, it's when those symptoms, the positive symptoms, which we'll talk about in a second, are a lot more pronounced. And then finally, we have the residual stage, which is when people's predominant symptoms may have disappeared or lessened considerably, and they may simply be withdrawn or have trouble concentrating and lack motivation. So they're not really exhibiting a lot of those kind of outward positive symptoms, which again we'll get to in a minute, but they kind of have a lingering sense that things are not really right. They may be more withdrawn than usual and have trouble kind of going and living about their kind of day-to-day life. There's a huge variety in terms of the progression of schizophrenia. Some people cycle through the 3 stages only a couple times throughout their entire life, while other people cycle repeatedly. And unfortunately, we see that the severity of the withdrawal during the residual phase tends to increase with repeated episodes. So the more times a person cycles through this kind of cycle of the 3 stages, the more likely that their residual phases are to result in really severe withdrawal from social activities or kind of their daily life. The symptoms of schizophrenia are typically most pronounced in the active phase, but there may be times when they do not occur during the active phase or do occur during the residual phase. So we have to keep in mind it's not a smooth transition. It doesn't just go kind of 1, 2, 3 in the stages and cycle right through. There's a lot of variation between them, and while typically the most pronounced symptoms are found in that active phase, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's always going to be the case. Also, we see that people with schizophrenia may experience short-term resurgence of symptoms, which are often triggered by stressful periods in their life. So even if they are kind of in remission or not exhibiting any symptoms at the time, if they go through a particularly stressful period in their life, those symptoms can kind of reemerge at times. Now we'll talk a bit about some of the symptoms of schizophrenia. So the key distinction to make when we're talking about symptoms of schizophrenia is between the positive and the negative symptoms. Positive symptoms refer to the presence of maladaptive behaviors, such as confused or paranoid thinking and inappropriate emotional reactions. So when we talk about positive symptoms, we're talking about things that are there now that shouldn't be. So things that have kind of begun to occur as a result of the schizophrenia. On the opposite side of that, we have our negative symptoms, which refers to the absence of adaptive behavior, such as absent or flat emotional reactions, lack of interacting with others in a social setting, and general lack of motivations. So again, you can see positive and negative. They're not really talking about good and bad. It's the same thing as way back in the learning chapter when we talked about positive and negative reinforcement. Positive symptoms means things that are kind of appearing that aren't there typically or shouldn't be there typically, whereas negative symptoms refer to when things aren't there that should be. So emotional reactions and interacting with people, the withdrawal, if those things are lacking, then we would consider them negative symptoms of schizophrenia. One of the common positive symptoms is the presence of hallucinations, which are defined as alterations in perception such that a person hears, sees, smells, feels, or tastes something that does not actually exist, except in that person's own mind. So hallucinations are very common with schizophrenia. The most common type of hallucination would be an auditory hallucination, which is kind of resulting in you hearing things that aren't there. So a lot of people with schizophrenia, they report hearing voices and things like that. The visual and other kind of tactile and olfactory and gustatory hallucinations, those are much more rare, but definitely the auditory hallucinations are quite common in those who suffer from schizophrenia. Hallucinations are often accompanied by what we call delusions. So delusions are beliefs that are not based on or well integrated with reality. So for example, people may have a delusion of being very famous or someone that, everyone admires and everyone looks up to. They may have a delusion of having some kind of divine purpose, so that they were created for this kind of greater good or to kind of complete this really important task. So a delusion is basically when they're having any kind of belief that isn't really based in reality. So there's a very common type of delusion, which is known as a delusion of grandeur, which refers to a belief that an individual is more important or talented than they really are. So some people with schizophrenia, they think that they're basically like a god, or that they're kind of the coming of, Jesus or another religious, really important religious character. They think that they've basically been sent to help others, and that they're very important and they have this very intense purpose in life. So example, your textbook talks about a man who suffered from schizophrenia who basically thought that he and only he had the ability to basically solve a math problem, solve some kinds of equations that nobody else in the world could solve. And in solving those, he was going to be able to unlock the secrets to a whole bunch of really crazy things. So that would be considered a delusion of grandeur, because he was thinking that, he was super important and he and only he had this ability. But he also showed a bit of paranoia in that he was very worried that other people were going to kind of figure out what he was doing, or kind of catch on to his purpose. So he also showed some paranoid delusions as well. So in addition to the hallucinations and delusions, individuals often exhibit what we call disorganized behavior, which is the considerable difficulty people with schizophrenia may have in completing the tasks of everyday life. So for example, even things like cooking, personal hygiene, socializing with others, those can become very difficult for someone who is suffering from schizophrenia. So we would consider those types of things, those difficulties, kind of disorganized behavior. Individuals with schizophrenia often typically experience a great deal of difficulty with cognitive processing as well, and social interactions. So your textbook goes a little bit more into detail with those, but I think the major ones to focus on here would be the hallucinations, delusions, and disorganized behavior, because those are really kind of the hallmark symptoms of schizophrenia. There are also, as I mentioned, some common subtypes of schizophrenia. So not everyone who has schizophrenia experiences it in the same way or experiences the same types of symptoms. So for some individuals with schizophrenia, their symptoms cluster into different patterns, which has led to the identification of various subtypes of the disorder. So the first common subtype is paranoid schizophrenia. This one is definitely one of the more common types of schizophrenia that we see exhibited. So symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia include delusional beliefs that one is being followed, watched, or persecuted, and may also include delusions of grandeur, or the belief that one has some secret insight, power, or some other characteristic that makes one particularly special. So basically, these people are very paranoid that someone is out to get them, and that somebody is watching them, and that somebody is kind of, means them harm in some way. And often this comes along with that delusion of grandeur. So having, like I mentioned, the guy I mentioned a minute ago, having the belief that he has the power to solve this problem, but being very paranoid that people are kind of looking out for him and they're out to get him. The second subtype is known as disorganized schizophrenia. So for disorganized schizophrenia, the symptoms include thoughts, speech, behaviors, and emotions that are poorly integrated and incoherent. So they're very just generally disorganized in their behavior, in their thoughts, in their speech. They're not able to function very well in day-to-day life. In contrast, someone with paranoid schizophrenia, they might seem like just an everyday normal person to anyone outside of their delusions. But in reality, their underlying thought processes would indicate much different. Whereas someone with disorganized schizophrenia, they're going to have a very hard time functioning in day-to-day life. Then we have catatonic schizophrenia. So catatonic schizophrenia refers to a particular subtype that includes episodes in which a person remains mute and immobile, sometimes in bizarre positions, for extended periods of time. So a lot of the time, somebody who is exhibiting symptoms of catatonic schizophrenia, they'll engage in what we call a catatonic stupor. They might just sit in one place and stare at a window for hours and hours on end without moving, without speaking. So it's kind of characterized by a lack of motion or a lack of action. Some individuals in catatonic schizophrenia may also exhibit repetitive purposeless movements. So it's still indicative of them kind of not really reacting to the environment around them. They're basically just repeating kind of a meaningless motion over and over again, with kind of mindlessly. The fourth subtype is undifferentiated schizophrenia, which is kind of a catch-all for individuals who show a combination of symptoms for more than one type of schizophrenia. So undifferentiated schizophrenia is going to be exhibiting symptoms from 2 or more, or even all of the other subtypes. And then finally, we have residual schizophrenia, which is a category that reflects individuals who show some symptoms of schizophrenia, but are either in transition to a full-blown episode or they're in remission. So it kind of relates to that residual phase of schizophrenia. So it's not so much a subtype as it is almost like a stage that they can be in where they have been showing some symptoms but aren't quite kind of in a full-blown schizophrenic episode yet. So increasing our knowledge of the complexity and variability of schizophrenia has allowed clinicians to improve treatment methods. So fortunately, because we've done so much research and we've identified these subtypes and the different symptoms and different phases of schizophrenia, it has helped us become more successful in treating it. But it still remains one of the most difficult mental disorders to treat because it is so varied and it does come with such severe deficits in functioning at times. So I have been leaving out a lot of the little kind of myths in the mind and, working the scientific literacy model section just in the interest of time. But this is one that I felt was really important to include because unfortunately a great deal of stigma exists concerning a diagnosis of schizophrenia. So this is mostly due to common misunderstandings about the disorder. I already mentioned one. Many people think that schizophrenia is the same thing as multiple personality or dissociative identity disorder. And unfortunately, a lot of people think that those who exhibit symptoms of schizophrenia may be violent or at times may even be exhibiting some type of genius. So although schizophrenia is a widely recognized term, many people have heard it before, there are many widespread misconceptions. People may also believe that the madness of schizophrenia is due to genius, like I kind of just mentioned. So there are several high-profile cases that do involve brilliant or dangerous individuals with schizophrenia. So for example, on the brilliant side of things, there was a very famous mathematician named John Nash. And there was actually a movie made about him called A Beautiful Mind. It was a really great movie, and it really portrays schizophrenia in one of the most accurate ways I've seen it portrayed in the media. And so he was a very, very brilliant individual. But that's not to say that just because he was brilliant and he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, that is something that's typically associated with schizophrenia. In fact, people with schizophrenia typically have more cognitive deficits than they would have kind of positive cognitive abilities. And in terms of dangerous individuals, the person who you may have heard referred to as the Unabomber, who obviously was a very dangerous individual, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. So again, because that's such a high profile case, many people then associate schizophrenia with someone being dangerous. But in reality, the facts are that people with schizophrenia are more likely to be a victim of violence than to be violent themselves. And this stands for pretty much any type of mental disorder. A lot of people, because of the unfortunate stigma that surrounds mental illness, a lot of people try to avoid people who have been diagnosed with mental illness. They think they might be dangerous or harmful to others. But in reality, people with mental illness are far more likely to become the victims of violence than to act violently. There are always extreme cases in any circumstance, but it is definitely not the norm that people with mental illness are violent in their tendencies. So finally, I don't want to go too much into this. I didn't really talk much about the causes of the other disorders, but because this whole module is on schizophrenia, I wanted to just mention some of the potential causes. So researchers are very curious about the underlying sources of schizophrenia and have used many techniques to try to determine its causes. In terms of genetics, studies have shown that as genetic relatedness increases, the chance of a relative of someone with schizophrenia developing the disorder also increases. So you can see from this little diagram here that people who are more genetically related, there tends to be a higher risk of them developing schizophrenia if one of their relatives is diagnosed with schizophrenia. And the other thing that I kind of wanted to mention about potential causes and sources of schizophrenia is what we call the neurodevelopmental hypothesis, which approaches the disorder from a biopsychosocial perspective. So it's looking at not only the biological, but also psychological and social factors that may have contributed to the onset of schizophrenia. So the neurodevelopmental hypothesis suggests that the manifestation of what we call schizophrenia is the outgrowth of disrupted neurological development early in the person's life. Schizophrenia actually may even be set in motion by environmental factors during prenatal development. So even while the child is still in the womb, there may be environmental factors influencing them that might contribute to the onset of schizophrenia. So it's definitely not just a kind of straightforward one thing causes it type scenario. As with most mental illness, there's a bunch of different sources, potential factors that might contribute to the onset of schizophrenia. But regardless of its origins, schizophrenia is undoubtedly one of the most misunderstood and stigmatized mental disorders, so it's very important for us to educate people about the realities of such disorders in order to help dispel myths and end the stigma surrounding both schizophrenia and other mental illnesses. So a part of why I love this chapter so much and I'm so passionate about it is because I think it's so important to educate people about these disorders, because only through education can we help eliminate the stigma and kind of dispel a lot of those myths that are out there surrounding mental illness. So that concludes chapter 15. If you have any questions, please let me know. This will be the content for Friday's class. And then next week, we're going to get started on chapter 16. Don't forget that your quiz for chapter 15 will open on Friday. So after Friday's class, it'll be open for the next week. And I'll be posting this, and I'll talk to you guys a little bit more in the forums about what's expected of you for the rest of the course. So thanks for listening, and I will be in contact with you soon.